The first boot hit her property line at 9:47 p.m. Sarah Brennan didn't need to see them to know they were there. The motion sensor she buried 3 inches below the frost line near the eastern fence tripped silent as a heartbeat, sending a pulse to the modified smartwatch on her wrist. 1 vibration, then 2, then 4. For men. She was in the kitchen when it happened, standing at the sink with her hands submerged in dishwater that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The plate she'd been washing, the same plate she'd been holding motionless for the last 10 minutes, slipped from her fingers and settled back into the gray water with barely a sound. Her reflection stared back at her from the window above the sink. 32 years old, hair pulled back tight, face harder than it had been 6 years ago when she'd left the Navy. 6 years since Kandahar. 6 years since the tribunal. 6 years since they'd stripped her of everything except the nightmares. Through the window, she could see nothing but darkness and the vague outline of pine trees against a moonless sky. Her property, all 47 acres of it, sprawled across the northern face of Mount Jackson in rural Washington state. 3 hours from Seattle and a lifetime from the person she used to be. She'd chosen this place specifically. Remote, defensible. Surrounded by national forest on 3 sides with only 1 road in. 1 road in meant 1 road out. She'd learned that lesson in Helmand Province. The watch vibrated again. They were moving west, following the fence line toward the main house. She could picture their formation without seeing it. Loose diamond, probably armed, definitely drunk or high on the kind of courage that comes from numbers and darkness and the assumption that a woman living alone in the mountains was easy prey. Sarah dried her hands on a dish towel, slowly, methodically, the way she'd been trained to control her breathing before a shot. Her heart rate was 50 beats per minute. Resting.com. She'd learned a long time ago that fear was just information, and information was only useful if you could think through it. She walked to the living room, her footsteps silent on the hardwood floors she'd installed herself. The room was sparse. A couch, a wood stove, a bookshelf with more empty spaces than books. No television, no photographs. Nothing that spoke to who she'd been before the mountain. The rifle was in the closet. She didn't go for it. Instead, she moved to the corner desk where 3 monitors glowed with a soft blue light. Her security system wasn't the kind you bought at a hardware store. It was the kind you built when you spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL sniper and another 2 years being investigated for something you did undo until they finally admitted you were right. But by then it was too late and your career was over and your team was dead, and all you had left was the knowledge that the world was full of threats, and most of them were friendly faces until they did unday. The monitors showed 16 different camera angles across her property. She'd installed them herself over the course of 3 months. Running fiber optic cables through PVC pipes she buried 4 feet deep to keep them safe from animals and weather and the kind of people who might think to cut them. Each camera had thermal overlay capability. Night vision, motion tracking. On screen 6, she could see them now. For thermal signatures moving through the trees near the eastern fence. They'd already crossed onto her land. The fence was designed to look intact from a distance, but she'd cut strategic sections and rigged them with pressure sensors months ago. Anyone who thought they were being clever by going around the obvious entry points was actually walking exactly where she wanted them to walk. She zoomed in. The lead man was big 6'2", maybe 220, wearing a flannel jacket and jeans. Behind him, 3 others, shorter, younger, moving with the kind of swagger that disappeared real quick when bullets started flying. One of them was carrying something. She enhanced the image. A baseball bat. They were laughing. She could see their mouths moving on the thermal feed, heads thrown back, shoulders shaking. One of them, the smallest one, wearing a backwards cap, made an exaggerated gesture toward the house, like he was miming kicking down a door. The others laughed harder. Sarah's expression didn't change. She clicked through to camera 9, which covered the western approach. Empty camera 12. Southern perimeter. Clear. Camera 3. T. Mine Road. A single vehicle parked a quarter-mile down. Engine still warm on the thermal read. A truck. Probably how they'd gotten here. She ran the calculations automatically for Hostiles, armed with improvised weapons, approaching from the east. Probable intoxication based on movement patterns and decision-making. Probable intent, vandalism, robbery, or worse. They'd chosen her. Property specifically, this wasn't random. Houses were sparse out here, separated by miles of forest. They'd driven past at least 3 other properties to get to hers. They'd chosen the woman living alone. They thought she was vulnerable. The watch vibrated 3 times. They'd reached the inner perimeter, 200 yards from the house. She had maybe 5 minutes before they reached the clearing. Sarah stood and walked to the window. She could see them now with her naked eye for flashlight beams cutting through the trees, moving with the overconfident carelessness of men who'd never had to consider consequences. Their laughter carried across the cold November air, sharp and cruel. She recognized that laughter. It was the same laughter she'd heard 6 years ago in the debriefing room when the male officers suggested maybe she misread the situation. Maybe her emotions had clouded her judgment. Maybe a woman sniper was unpsychologically suited for the kind of split-second decisions that cost 3 Taliban insurgents their lives and saved an entire platoon. They'd laughed when she insisted she'd followed protocol. They laughed when she showed them the evidence. They laughed right up until the independent investigation proved she'd been right. But by then, her team leader was dead from an IED, and she was the convenient scapegoat, and the Navy decided the easiest solution was an honorable discharge, with full benefits and a quiet exit, and everyone could move on except her because she was the one who had to live with the fact that she'd done everything right and still lost everything. The laughter stopped being funny after that. On the monitor, the 4 men emerged from the tree line into the clearing. They paused, flashlights sweeping across her property. The main house was small, 1,200 square feet, single story, cedar siding she'd stained herself. There was a detached garage, a tool shed, a greenhouse she'd built last spring, solar panels on the roof, a satellite dish. To anyone looking, it seemed ordinary. Isolated, but ordinary. They didn't see the spiderweb. That's what she called it. The spiderweb. 6 months of work. Hundreds of hours of planning, digging, wiring, testing. She'd built it the same way she'd built her hide sites in Afghanistan, with patience, precision, and the understanding that the best defense wasn't a locked door. It was knowing your terrain better than anyone else could ever hope to. The big man in the flannel jacket pointed toward the house. The others nodded. They started forward, crossing the clearing in a loose line, their confidence growing with every step. 50 yards from the house. 40. 30. Sarah picked up the radio transmitter from her desk. It was a modified walkie-talkie connected to a speaker system she'd demounted in the trees around the property. She'd tested it once, 3 months ago, just to make sure it worked. The sound quality was excellent, clear enough to hear a whisper from 200 yards. She pressed the talk button. Stop. Her voice cut through the darkness like a blade. All 4 men froze, flashlights jerking wildly as they searched for the source. One of them, the one with the baseball bat, actually dropped his weapon. It hit the ground with a dull thud. "You're trespassing," Sarah continued, her voice calm, measured, projected through speakers they couldn't locate in the dark. "You have 10 seconds to turn around and leave my property. If you're still here at 0, I will consider you an active threat." For a moment, there was silence. Then the big man laughed. "Or what?" he shouted into the darkness, his voice slurred and thick. "You gonna call the cops? Out here surf's an hour away? Honey, ain't nobody coming to help you." The others joined in, their laughter echoing across the clearing. 10, Sarah said. "This is private property, bitch." One of the younger ones yelled, "You can't just 9. We just want to talk." The big man called out, moving forward again. "Maybe have a little fun. Been watching you up here, all alone. Thought you might want some company." 8. They were still advancing. 25 yards now. 7. "You threatening us?" The big man's voice had an edge now, anger bleeding through the alcohol. "That's real cute. Real tough hiding in your house." 6. One of them, the smallest one with the backwards cap, pulled something from his jacket. Even in the darkness, Sarah could see the outline. A pistol. Probably a 9mm, based on the profile. 5. "Hey! SEAL girl!" The one with the gun shouted. He'd done his research. He knew who she was. We heard about you. Heard you got kicked out for being crazy. Heard you killed some kids over there and tried to blame it on 4. They were 20 yards from the house now. The one with the gun was raising it, pointing it vaguely in the direction of the windows. The others had spread out, flanking. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't robbery. 3. Sarah's heart rate was 61 beats per minute. She set down the radio and picked up a different remote. This one was smaller, with a single toggle switch and a numeric keypad. She'd built it from parts she'd ordered online over the course of 6 months. Each component purchased from a different vendor, shipped to different addresses, assembled in the privacy of her garage where no one could ask questions. 2. The big man was 10 feet from her porch steps. 1. He put his boot on the first step. "All right, crazy bitch. We're coming in." Sarah flipped the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the clearing erupted in light. 47 halogen flood, lamps, each one positioned with surgical precision around the perimeter of the clearing, blazed to life simultaneously, turning night into noon in less than a second. The effect was instantaneous and devastating, for men who'd been relying on flashlights and darkness were suddenly blind, their eyes unable to adjust to the sudden overwhelming brightness. They screamed, hands flying to their faces, flashlights dropping, stumbling backward. But Sarah wasn't done. She pressed 1-4 on keypad. The ground beneath their feet erupted in sound. Not explosions. She wasn't trying to kill them. Not yet, but air horns. Dozens of team buried in weatherproof containers just below the surface, all connected to the same trigger system, all firing at once with a combined decibel level that exceeded a jet engine at takeoff. The effect on the human nervous system was immediate. Disorientation, panic, pain. The 4 men dropped to their knees, hands over their ears, mouths open, and screams that couldn't be heard over the shrieking mechanical wail. Sarah watched through the window, her expression unchanged. She pressed 2-7. The sprinkler system activated, but it wasn't water. She'd modified the system herself, replacing the municipal feed with a pressurized tank filled with a mixture she'd developed over months of experimentation. Capsaicin extract, suspended in a food-grade vegetable oil base, aerosolized through modified spray nozzles that created a fine mist capable of covering 100 square feet in under 3 seconds. Pepper spray, essentially. Industrial grade. The mist hit them like a living thing. The big man went down first, clawing at his face, his screams joining the mechanical chorus. The others followed, rolling on the ground, trying to escape something that was already in their eyes, their noses, their throats, their lungs. Sarah typed 3-9. The lights cut to infrared. To her, watching through night vision on her monitors, the scene was perfectly clear. 4 men incapacitated in the killing field she'd created, writhing in pain, but alive, neutralized but not dead. She could have killed them. The rifle in the closet had a loaded magazine, and she could make a headshot at 200 yards in a crosswind with iron sights. At 20 yards, in a controlled environment, with targets that couldn't move or fight back, it would have been trivial. But she'd left the Navy because she was tired of killing, even when they deserved it. She picked up the radio again. "You have 2 choices," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of air horns and screaming. "Choice 1, you leave now, crawl back to your truck, drive away, never come back, never speak about this. If I see any of you within 10 miles of my property again, I will not be as generous." She paused. "Choice 2, you stay here and I call the sheriff. You get arrested for armed trespassing, assault with a deadly weapon, and whatever else I can think of while we wait for them to arrive. In about an hour, while you lie there in pain." She pressed a button. The air horns cut off. The sudden silence was almost as disorienting as the noise had been. "Choose." The big man was sobbing now, mucus and tears streaming down his face, his tough guy swagger erased by capsaicin and fear. He tried to stand, failed, crawled forward on his hands and knees toward the tree line. The others followed. It took them 11 minutes to reach the fence. Sarah watched on thermal, tracking their progress as they stumbled and crawled and dragged each other back the way they'd come. The one who'd pulled the gun, he'd dropped it when the lights hit, and she'd already marked its location for retrieval later kept. Stopping to vomit, the smallest one was crying, calling for his mother. They reached the truck at 10:23 p.m. The engine started, taillights disappeared down the mountain road. Sarah waited another 20 minutes, watching the monitors, making sure they were really gone and not circling back. When she was satisfied, she shut down the defense systems one by one, methodically, checking each component to make sure nothing had malfunctioned. Everything had worked perfectly. Of course it had. She'd tested every element 100 times. At 10:47 p.m., she put on a jacket and walked outside into the clearing. The air smelled like capsaicin and fierce wet. She found the pistol where the thermal scan had marked it. A Glock 19, serial number filed off, probably stolen. She cleared it, removed the magazine, and added it to the collection in her safe. Evidence, if she ever needed it. She stood in the clearing for a long time, looking up at the stars that were finally visible through the dissipating mist. The November cold bit at her face and hands, but she didn't move. She was thinking about Kandahar, about the tribunal, about the laughter, about the fact that she'd built a life in these mountains, specifically so she could be left alone, and men still couldn't let her have that. Her watch vibrated. New movement on the sensors. Her hand moved to her sidearm, a Sigsair Pedos Doses. She wore in a hip holster, even in her own house, before she checked the monitor on her watch. Eastern perimeter. Single signature. Moving slowly. Too small to be human. She relaxed. Deer, probably. Or elk. The mountain was full of them this time of year. She walked back to the house, locked the door behind her, and returned to the kitchen. The dishes were still in the sink. The water now ice cold. She drained it, refilled it with hot water, and started washing again. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was 58 beats per minute. Outside, the mountain was quiet. Inside, Sarah Brennan was already planning upgrades to the spiderweb. Because they'd come once, they might come again. And next time, she'd be ready. Chapter 2. The sheriff's SUV appeared on camera 12 at 7:34 a.m., kicking up dust on the unpaved road that wound up the mountain to Sarah's property. She'd been awake since 5 a.m. She was always awake by 5 a.m. Had been since boot camp, and she'd spent the last 2 hours running maintenance on the defense systems, replacing the capsaicin cartridges and resetting the pressure sensors along the eastern fence. She watched the SUV approach on her monitors, zooming in to read the county seal on the door. Sheriff's Department. Singom Occupant. Moving at a cautious speed, the way law enforcement always moved when approaching an unknown situation in rural territory. Sarah set down her coffee black, no sugar, still a tan, walked to the gun safe in her bedroom. The Glock 19 from last night was already logged and stored. She ran through a mental checklist. Pistol on her hip. Check. Rifle in the closet. Loaded but safety on. Check. Shotgun behind the door. Also loaded. Check. None of it was illegal. Washington State had open carry laws, and this was her property. But appearances mattered. She removed the hip holster and locked the SIG in the safe. If the sheriff was here about last night, and he almost certainly was starting the conversation armed, would send the wrong message. She'd learned that lesson the hard way in the Navy. Sometimes the most strategic move was to appear less dangerous than you actually were. The SUV pulled into the clearing at 7:41 a.m. and parked 20 feet from the porch. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Gray hair. Weathered face. The kind of build that had been solid muscle 20 years ago and was now settling into comfortable authority. He wore the standard county sheriff's uniform, brown and tan, badge on his chest, utility belt heavy with equipment he probably hadn't needed to use in months. Sheriff Marcus Webb. Sarah had researched him when she'd first moved to the mountain 3 years ago. 28 years with the department. Decorated veteran from the First Gulf War, widower, 2 adult children, clean record, well-liked in the community. By all accounts, a good cop, which meant he'd be smart enough to be dangerous if he decided she was a problem. She opened the door before he could knock. "Sheriff Webb," she said, her voice neutral. "What can I do for you?" He stopped on the bottom porch step, his hand resting casually on his belt knot near his weapon. She noted. Just a comfortable stance. His eyes were doing what cops' eyes always did. Scanning, cataloging, assessing threat levels without seeming to... He was looking at her face, her posture, her hands, looking for signs of aggression, or fear, or guilt. He wouldn't find any. "Miss Brennan," he said, his voice carrying the kind of easy authority that came from decades of dealing with difficult situations. "Mind if I come in? Got a few questions I'd like to ask you. About 4 men who showed up at the urgent care clinic in Cascade Falls at around 11:30 last night with severe chemical burns to their faces and eyes, said they'd been attacked." Sarah's expression didn't change. "That's terrible. I hope they're all right." Webb smiled, not a friendly smile, but not hostile either. The kind of smile that said he'd been doing this job long enough to recognize when someone was choosing their words carefully. "They said it happened on your property." "Did they mention they were trespassing?" "Armed, he did not." "Interesting." Webb tilted his head slightly. "So it's true. They were here." Sarah considered her options. She could refuse to talk without a lawyer. That was her right, and Webb would respect it because he had to. But refusing to cooperate would make her look guilty. And she wasn't guilty. She'd defended her property against armed intruders. Everything she'd done was legal under Washington's Stand Your Ground laws. Mostly legal. The modifications to the sprinkler system existed in a gray area she'd prefer not to have examined too closely. "Yes," she said finally. "4 men trespassed on my property last night around 9:45 p.m. They ignored multiple verbal warnings to leave. One of them was armed with what appeared to be a pistol. I defended my home using non-lethal means. They left shortly after." Webb nodded slowly, processing. "Non-lethal means?" "That's correct. The clinic said their symptoms were consistent with exposure to industrial-grade pepper spray. Maybe CS gas. They're going to need follow-up treatment for corneal damage." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" Sarah met his eyes. "No?" The honesty seemed to surprise him. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Want to tell me what happened?" "I just did." "Want to tell me the detailed version?" Sarah stepped aside, gesturing into the house. "Would you like some coffee, Sheriff?" They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she ate every meal alone, where she cleaned her weapons, where she sometimes sat for hours staring at nothing because the nightmares made sleep impossible. Webb held a mug of coffee she'd poured him but hadn't drunk from. He was still assessing, still cataloging. The house would tell him things about her. Sparse furniture, military precision in the organization, no personal photographs, security monitors in the corner, the faint smell of gun oil and coffee, and the kind of solitude that became a presence in itself after enough time. "I did 2 tours in Iraq," Webb said suddenly. 2003 and 2005. "So I recognize the setup you've got here. The cameras, the sight lines, the way you've cleared the trees around the perimeter to create a kill zone." "It's not a kill zone. What would you call it? A defensive perimeter." Semantics. Sarah sipped her own coffee. "You didn't come here to discuss landscaping." "No." Webb set down his mug. "I came here because for local men, stupid men, drunk men, but still local men that I've known since they were kids, told me they drove up here last night planning to scare the crazy SEAL lady. Their words, not mine. They said they were just going to mess around, maybe knock over your mailbox or something. Dumb stuff. And instead they got blinded and burned and had to crawl back to their truck crying for their mothers. They were armed with a baseball bat and a pistol." Webb's expression shifted. "They didn't mention a pistol." "Of course they didn't." Sarah stood and walked to the safe in her bedroom. She returned with the Glock 19, cleared and magazine removed, and set it on the table between them. "This was dropped in my clearing last night. Serial numbers been filed off. I'm guessing it's stolen." Webb stared at the weapon for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and took several photographs. The gun, the table, the position, everything documented. When he was done, he looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. You know what this means? Asked. It means they committed multiple felonies on my property and then lied to law enforcement about it. It also means you have a legal justification for what you did. I know. Webb leaned back in his chair. So why didn't you call me last night? It was a good question. The right question. The one she'd been expecting since he arrived. Because I handled it, Sarah said simply. That's not how the law works. Isn't it? Stand your ground. Castle doctrine. I was on my property, facing armed intruders, and I used proportional force to neutralize the threat without causing permanent injury or death. I think that's exactly how the law works. Webb was quiet for a moment. Then, the clinic said one of them kept mumbling about traps and lights and screaming metal. What does that mean? Sarah had prepared for this question to Moshi-activated floodlights. Legal. And air horns, triggered by pressure sensors. Also legal. I have a right to defend my property, Sheriff. Just because I'm good at it doesn't make it illegal. Good at it. Webb laughed short and sharp, with no humor in it. Lady, you militarized 47 acres of Washington State Forest. That's not good at it. That's something else entirely. What would you have done? Sarah asked, leaning forward. If you were a woman living alone in the mountains, and 4 armed men crossed your fence at night, laughing, threatening you, would you have called for help and waited an hour? Would you have hoped they were just going to knock over your mailbox? Webb didn't answer immediately. His fingers drummed against the table in conscious, rhythmic, the kind of thing people did when they were thinking hard about something they didn't want to think about. No, he said finally, I probably would have shot them. I didn't know. You didn't. He stood up, leaving the coffee untouched. Here's what's going to happen. Ms. Brennan, I'm going to take that pistol as evidence. I'm going to run the serial number and see if it's connected to any crimes. I'm going to interview those 4 idiots again. And this time, I'm going to ask them very specific questions about firearms and trespassing and making terroristic threats. He paused at the door. And then I'm going to forget I saw anything else on this property. The lights, the sensors, the whole James Bond setup you've got running here. Because technically, none of it's illegal. And honestly, I've got bigger problems than a former Navy SEAL who wants to be left alone on her mountain. Sarah nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me. Webb's expression was hard. Those boys are idiots, but they're not the only idiots in this county. Word's going to spread about what happened up here. Some people are going to think you're crazy. Some are going to think you're dangerous. And some of the worst ones are going to think what happened last night is a challenge. Let them come. That's what I'm afraid of. He opened the door, then stopped. You know what your problem is, Ms. Brennan? I have several. You'll need to be more specific. Your problem is you're still fighting a war that ended 6 years ago. You built a fire base on this mountain and you're manning it alone, waiting for enemies that might not come. And that's no way to live. Sarah's jaw tightened. You don't know anything about how I live. I know you don't have any friends, no family that visits, no social connections in town. I know you've been here 3 years, and the only time anyone sees you is when you drive into Cascade Falls once a month for supplies. I know you're isolated and armed and skilled enough to be dangerous, which is a combination that usually ends badly. Is there a point to this? Website? The point is, I'm not your enemy. The law isn't your enemy. And treating everyone like they're hostile isn't protecting you, it's just making sure you stay alone. He walked down the porch steps toward his SUV. Sarah watched him go, her hands steady, her heart rate calm. Sheriff, she called out. He turned. Those men last night. They knew who I was. They knew I'd been a SEAL. They knew about Kandahar. Someone told them. Webb's expression darkened. I'll look into it. And if you find out who, I'll handle it legally. I suggest you do the same. Edrav Hawaii, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway of her fortress, watching the dust settle on the road, alone. always alone. She went back inside and locked the door. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the security monitors and the distant sound of wind through the pines. She sat down at her desk and pulled up the footage from last night, watching it again, analyzing every moment, looking for ways to improve the response time, the effectiveness, the message. Because Webb was wrong. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a different battlefield, and she was very, very good at war. End of Chapter 2 to 4,502 words. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. The first email arrived 3 days after Sheriff Webb's visit. Sarah found it at 6:14 a.m. while running her daily security check scanning local news. Police reports, social media activity in Cascade Falls and the surrounding townships. She'd set up Google alerts for her name, her address, and keywords like Navy SEAL and Mount Jackson and assault. Most days the alerts were empty. This morning there were 47 new results. She clicked the first one. It was a Facebook post from someone named Derek Hutchins, the big man in the flannel jacket. She recognized him from the profile photo posted 2 days ago at 11:47 p.m. The post had been shared 632 times. Watch out. Psycho ex-military. Living up on Mount Jackson attacked me and my boys for nitrogen monoxide reason. We was just checking on her 'cause she seemed lonely, and she gassed us like we were terrorists. This is who they let in the military now. Crazy women who attack innocent people. Someone needs to do something before she kills somebody. Share this. The comments were worse. What did you expect, bro? She's one of those feminist soldiers who probably hates men. I heard she got kicked out for shooting civilians. Why is she even allowed to live there? Shouldn't crazy people be in hospitals? Someone should teach her a lesson. I know where that property is. Me and my boys should pay her a visit. Sarah scrolled through the thread with clinical detachment, cataloging the threats implicit and explicit and cross-referencing the names with publicly available data. Most of them were local. Young men, mostly, some with criminal records she could access through public court documents. Several with connections to militia groups or anti-government organizations. The second email was from a reporter. Senora Brennan, my name is Jennifer Correa, and I'm a journalist with the Seattle Tribune. I'm working on a story about the incident on your property last week, and I'd love to get your side of things. The men involved are claiming you attacked them without provocation, and there's growing concern in the community about Sarah deleted it without finishing. The third email was from her former commanding officer. That one, she read, Sarah, I heard about the situation in Washington. I'm not going to ask if you're okay because I know you'll say you are, whether it's true or not. I'm just going to remind you that you have options. You don't have to do this alone. Call me Commander James Mitchell, U.S. NRET. She stared at the screen for a long time, her finger hovering over the reply button. Mitchell had been one of the few officers who'd supported her during the investigation. He'd testified on her behalf, provided character references, fought to keep her in the Navy, even when it became clear the decision had already been made. After her discharge, he'd called once a month for the first year, then every other month, then quarterly. She hadn't answered in 18 months. What would she even say? I'm fine, sir. I built a fortress on a mountain, and I spend my days maintaining weapons, systems, and waiting for threats that may or may not materialize. I haven't had a real conversation with another human being in 3 years. I sleep 4 hours a night. When I sleep at all, I'm absolutely fine. She closed the email and opened her security feeds. The property was quiet. Morning sun filtered through the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. On Camera 9, she could see a pair of deer browsing near the western fence. On Camera 4, a raven was perched on top of one of her motion sensors, cleaning its feathers. Everything was peaceful. Everything was wrong. Her tactical sense, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 8 years of combat operations, was screaming at her. The social media post wasn't just angry venting, it was a call to action, and the 47 new search results meant it was spreading. The reporter's email meant it was escalating into public attention. The whole situation was developing in ways she couldn't control from behind her monitors. She needed intelligence. At 9 a.m., Sarah drove into Cascade Falls for the first time in 2 weeks. The town wasn't much population, 3,200. one main street. A handful of shops and restaurants clustered around a central square with a gazebo and a war memorial. She parked her truck, a 15-year-old Ford F-150. She'd bought cash 3 years ago and maintained herself in front of the general store and sat for a moment, observing. The town felt different. People were looking at her. A woman loading groceries into her car glanced up, made eye contact with Sarah, then quickly looked away and hurried into her vehicle. Two men standing outside the hardware store stopped talking when Sarah stepped out of her truck, watching her with expressions that weren't quite hostile, but weren't friendly either. A teenager walking past whispered something to his friend, and both of them turned to stare. She'd become known. Sarah walked into the general store with her head up and her shoulders back, the way she'd been trained to walk into hostile territory, confident but not aggressive, aware but not paranoid. The store was owned by a woman named Margaret Chun, 60-something third-generation American, sharp as a tack. Sarah had been shopping here for 3 years, and Margaret had never asked invasive questions, which was one of the reasons Sarah kept coming back. That changed today. Sarah. Margaret's voice was tight, controlled. She was standing behind the counter, her hands resting on the surface in a way that seemed deliberate, like she was bracing for something. We need to talk. About the fact that half this town thinks you're some kind of vigilante, and the other half thinks you're a psychopath, and both halves want to know if I'm comfortable selling supplies to you. Sarah set her shopping list on the counter. Are you? Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Then she sighed and started pulling items from the shelves behind her: coffee, canned goods, batteries, first aid supplies. Everything Sarah bought every month, without variation. Those Boy Continuer 1410 who came up to your place, Margaret said while she worked, not looking at Sarah. Derek Hutchins and his friends. I've known them since they were in diapers. Derek's father used to work at the mill before it closed. His mother cleaned houses. They're not bad kids, just stupid. Young and stupid and bored. They were armed, I heard. Margaret rang up the items one by one, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. I also heard you have some kind of military-grade security system up there that could probably stop a small army. That true? It's legal? Legal isn't the same as normal. Sarah, normal got me nothing in Afghanistan, except a court-martial investigation and a destroyed career. So, forgive me if I'm not particularly concerned with normal. Margaret stopped scanning and looked at Sarah directly. You know what the problem is? You moved here 3 years ago, and you never tried to be part of this community. You kept to yourself, which is fine. Lots of people do, but then something like this happens, and people don't know you, so they fill in the blanks with whatever story makes sense to them. And right now, the story going around is that you're dangerous. I am dangerous. That's not what Margaret cut herself off, closing her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her expression had softened slightly. Look, I don't know what happened to you over there. I don't know why you chose to live alone on that mountain, but I do know that the way you're handling this, isolating yourself, threatening people, treating everyone like an enemy, it's only going to make things worse. Sarah pulled out cash to pay for the supplies. What would you have me do? Apologize to the men who trespassed on my property with weapons? Throw a community barbecue to prove I'm not a threat? Maybe not a barbecue. Margaret sighed, accepting the payment. But you could start by talking to people. Sheriff Webb. The town council. Show them you're not what they think you are. And what do they think I am? A ticking time bomb. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah gathered her supplies without responding. She was almost to the door when Margaret called out behind her. Sarah, for what it's worth, I don't think you're crazy. I think you're scared, and I think scared people make bad decisions when they're alone. Sarah left without answering. The town council meeting was held every second Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center, a converted church building on the north end of town. Sarah had never attended one before. She'd never seen the point. She didn't have opinions about road maintenance or school funding or zoning regulations. She paid her property taxes, followed the laws, and stayed out of everyone's way. But Margaret was right about one thing. Isolation was becoming a liability. She arrived at 6:55 p.m. and sat in the back row, watching as the room filled with familiar faces, people she'd seen around town but never spoken to. The mayor was a man named Robert Thornton, early 60s, retired insurance agent, the kind of officious personality that thrived on small-town politics. When he saw Sarah sit down, his expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or concern. The meeting started on time. For the first 40 minutes, it was exactly as boring as Sarah had expected. Budget reports, permit applications, a lengthy debate about whether to repave Oak Street this year or next. She half-listened, keeping her attention divided between the speakers and the room itself, cataloging exits, assessing potential threats, maintaining situational awareness. Then, during open public comment, Derek Hutchins stood up. Sarah's pulse didn't change 61 beats per minute, steady as a metronome, but every nerve in her body came alive with focus. Hutchins looked worse than he had in his Facebook photo. His eyes were still red and swollen from the pepper spray, his face splotchy with chemical burns that would probably scar. He walked to the front of the room with exaggerated slowness, like he was making sure everyone saw his injuries. "Mr. Mayor," he said, his voice rough and damaged, "I want to file a formal complaint against Sarah Brennan." Every head in the room turned to look at her. Sarah didn't move. "Mr. Hutchins," Thornton said carefully, "this is a town council meeting, not a court of law. If you have a legal complaint, you should." "I tried that," Hutchins interrupted. Sheriff Webb said, "There's not enough evidence to press charges, because we trespassed. I wasn't armed, even though I told him I wasn't. But that doesn't change the fact that this woman," he pointed at Sarah, "is dangerous and unstable and living on a property that's basically a military compound. She attacked me and my friends for no reason. You crossed my fence at night," Sarah said calmly from the back of the room, "armed with a baseball bat and a pistol. You ignored verbal warnings to leave. You threatened violence. What happened next was self-defense." The room erupted. People were talking over each other, some supporting Hutchins, others demanding Sarah explain herself, others calling for order. Mayor Thornton was banging his gavel, trying to restore control. It was chaos, and through it all, Sarah sat perfectly still, watching. This was what they wanted. She realized the spectacle, the drama. It wasn't about justice or safety or truth, it was about entertainment. She was the outsider, the veteran, the woman who didn't fit their narrative of what rural Washington should look like. They wanted her to be a problem so they could feel justified in their suspicions. "Enough." Thornton's voice cut through the noise. The room fell silent. He looked exhausted. "Senora Brennan, would you like to address the council?" Sarah stood. She walked to the front of the room with the same measured pace she'd used when approaching her CO's office for debriefing. When she turned to face the crowd, she could see it in their faces. Fear, curiosity, judgment, fascination. They were waiting for her to be what they expected: aggressive, defensive, unstable. She disappointed them. "My name is Sarah Brennan," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I served 8 years as a Navy SEAL sniper. I completed 4 combat deployments. I have 16 confirmed enemy kills, and I saved the lives of at least 47 Americans. I was honorably discharged in 2019 after an investigation that ultimately cleared me of all charges, but ended my career anyway." She paused, letting that sink in. "I moved to this community 3 years ago because I wanted peace. I wanted isolation. I wanted to be left alone. I bought property legally. I pay my taxes. I don't bother anyone. But apparently, the fact that I'm a woman living alone in the mountains is threatening to some people. So threatening that 4 men decided to cross my fence at night, armed, making threats. I defended myself using non-lethal means. They were unharmed enough to drive themselves to a clinic. They lied to law enforcement about what happened. And now I'm here, being accused of being dangerous, when the only thing I did was refuse to be a victim." She looked directly at Derek Hutchins. "You want to file a complaint? File it, but understand that Sheriff Webb has the pistol that was dropped on my property that night, the one with the serial number filed off, the one that's probably connected to crimes in this county. So, if you want to push this, We can push it all the way to court, and we can see who the jury believes. A decorated combat veteran defending her home. Or for local boys with a history of harassment who thought it would be fun to terrorize a woman in the dark. Hutchins' face went pale. Sarah turned back to the counsel. I don't want problems with this community. I never did. But I will not apologize for protecting myself, and I will not dismantle the security systems on my property just because they make you uncomfortable. If you want me gone, you'll have to find a legal way to make that happen. Until then, I'm a citizen of this town, and I have the same rights as anyone else here. She walked back to her seat. The room was silent. Mayor Thornton cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Brennan. This council has no jurisdiction over private property security as long as it complies with state and federal law. Mr. Hutchins, if you wish to pursue this further, you'll need to do so through the sheriff's department or the courts. The meeting adjourned. 20 minutes later, Sarah was almost to her truck when a voice called out behind her. Ms. Brennan, wait. Se tourned. It was a woman, maybe 45, wearing a Cascade Falls Volunteer Fire Department jacket. She had kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. I'm Rachel Donnelly, the woman said, extending her hand. I run the trauma support group at the community center. We meet every Monday night. Veterans. Mostly, but also first responders and anyone else who's been through hell and needs people who understand. Sarah didn't take the offered hand. I don't need a support group. Didn't say you did, but the offer stands. Rachel pulled out a business card and held it out. We've got 8 regulars, 3 Iraq vets, 2 Afghanistan, 1 Vietnam, and 2 local cops who've seen their share of bad stuff. No judgment, no pressure. Just people who get it? Sarah hesitated, then took the card. Think about it, Rachel said. You gave a good speech in there. But speeches don't keep you warm at night when the nightmares come. People do. She walked away before Sarah could respond. Sarah didn't go to the Monday meeting, or the one after that. But she kept the card, and 3 weeks later, when the nightmares got bad enough that she went 72 hours without sleep and started seeing threats and shadows that weren't there, she drove to the community center at 6:55 p.m. and sat in her truck for 20 minutes, trying to decide if she was really going to do this. At 7:16 p.m., she walked inside. The meeting was in a small room with a circle of chairs and terrible fluorescent lighting. 8 people sat in various states of alertness, holding paper cups of coffee and wearing expressions Sarah recognized. Guarded hope mixed with exhausted skepticism. These were people who'd learned the hard way that vulnerability was dangerous. Rachel Donnelly looked up when Sarah entered, and her face broke into a genuine smile. Welcome, she said simply. Grab a chair. Sarah sat. For the first 15 minutes, she didn't speak. She just listened as a man named Carlos talked about his struggles with anger, and a woman named Jenny described her difficulty reconnecting with her teenage daughter, and an older man named Frank made a dry joke about his medication that made everyone laugh in the way only people who understood dark humor could laugh. Then Rachel turned to Sarah. You're new. Want to introduce yourself? You can share as much or as little as you want. Sarah's first instinct was to say no. Her second instinct was to leave. Her third instinct was to remember Margaret Chun's words. Scared people make bad decisions when they're alone. My name is Sarah, she said quietly. I was a Navy SEAL sniper. I got out 6 years ago. I've been living alone on Mount Jackson for 3 years, and I think I might be worse at being alone than I thought I was. Rachel nodded. That's a good start. It wasn't much, but it was something. Over the next 3 months, things changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small ways that accumulated into something resembling a life instead of just survival. Sarah kept attending the Monday meetings. She didn't share much old habits, died hard, but she listened, and occasionally she'd offer tactical advice that the other veterans appreciated, and once she helped Carlos develop a breathing technique that worked better than his prescribed medication for managing panic attacks. She started shopping in town more often, staying long enough to exchange pleasantries with Margaret Chun instead of just grabbing supplies and leaving. She hired a local contractor to repair the roof on her garage, not because she couldn't do it herself, but because Rachel had suggested that being part of a community meant letting people help you sometimes. She even accepted Sheriff Webb's invitation to guest speak at a self-defense workshop for women at the community center, where she taught 23 local women basic tactical awareness and escape techniques without once mentioning the fortress she'd built on her mountain. The social media posts about her gradually faded as newer dramas captured the town's attention. Derek Hutchins and his friends were charged with illegal possession of a firearm. The Glock had been traced to a burglary 2 counties over and trespassing. They accepted plea deals that involved community service and probation. Sarah never saw them again. The nightmares didn't stop, but they got less frequent. And on the nights when they were particularly bad, Sarah had Rachel's number saved in her phone, and sometimes she'd even call it, and they'd talk until the skies started to lighten and the panic eased enough to breathe again. 6 months after that first town council meeting, Sarah was working in her garden shed, expanded the greenhouse, and started growing vegetables, more than she could eat alone, which meant she'd started giving the excess to Rachel for the community centers. Food bank. When her security system alerted her to movement on the eastern perimeter. Single signature approaching slowly. She checked the camera feed on her watch, expecting to see a deer or an elk. Instead, she saw Commander James Mitchell walking up the access road in civilian clothes, carrying a backpack and moving with the careful deliberation of a man who suspected he might be walking into a defensive perimeter and wanted to make his non-hostile intentions very clear. Sarah's chest tightened. She walked to the edge of the clearing and waited. When Mitchell saw her, he stopped, raising one hand in greeting. Permission to approach a cutout. Granted, he crossed the clearing and stopped a respectful distance away. He looked older than she remembered, more gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes, but the core of him was the same, steady, competent, unwavering. "Commander," Sarah said. "Sarah." He studied her face. "You look better than I expected." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I expected to find you on this mountain alone, armed to the teeth, and about one bad day away from a complete breakdown." She couldn't help it. She laughed. It was a rusty sound, like machinery that hadn't been used in years, but it was real. "Well," she said, "you're only about 60%, right?" Mitchell smiled. "That's improvement." They talked for 2 hours. He told her about his retirement, his grandchildren, the consulting work he'd been doing with veteran organizations. She told him about the mountain, the town, the support group, the slow and painful process of becoming something other than a weapon. "I'm proud of you," he said finally. "I know that doesn't fix what happened. I know it doesn't give you back what you lost. But I wanted you to know." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You know what the hardest part of coming home is?" Mitchell asked. "What?" "Realizing that all the skills that kept you alive over there, the hypervigilance, the threat assessment, the tactical thinking, they don't turn off just because the war ends. You spend years training to be ready for anything, and then you come home and you're supposed to just stop. And the world feels dangerous because to you, it is dangerous. You see threats everywhere because you were trained to see threats everywhere." "Yeah," Sarah said quietly. "Yeah, I know. But here's the thing." Mitchell leaned forward. "You can't unlearn those skills. They're part of you now, but you can learn to use them differently. You can choose what you're defending. And maybe instead of defending yourself against the whole world, you could defend something worth fighting for." "Like what?" "Like a community that needs people who know how to stand up when things get hard. Like veterans who need someone who understands. Like a life that's about more than just surviving until tomorrow." Sarah looked out across her property. A 47 acres she'd turned into a fortress. The cameras and sensors and defensive systems she'd built to keep the world out. It had seemed so necessary 6 months ago. Essential. The only way to stay safe. Now it just looked lonely. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted. "You're already doing it." Mitchell sighed. "You went to that town council meeting. You joined that support group. You're growing vegetables. For God's sake." That's not survival, Sarah. That's living. He stood to leave, shouldering his backpack. One more thing, he said. I'm starting a training program for veteran peer counselors. 3-month intensive course, then placement with VA hospitals and veteran centers across the country. We need people who've been through hell and came out the other side. People who can reach veterans that the system can't reach. I think you'd be good at it. I'm not a counselor. No. You're a woman who built a defensive fortress on a mountain and then had the courage to walk down into town and ask for help. That's the hardest thing a soldier can do, and that makes you exactly what we need. He handed her a folder with program details. Think about it, he said. No pressure, but the offer's there. Sarah took the folder. She watched him walk back down the access road, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared around the bend. Then she stood in the clearing for a long time, holding the folder, feeling the weight of possibility. That night, she didn't check the security feeds before bed. It was a small thing, but it was a start.